My name is Jim Dingman, and we're very pleased today to have Professor Ervant Abrahamian joining us to talk about the situation in the Middle East. The title of this is Trump 2.0, the Middle East, and uh, Iran. And of course, Ervant is no stranger to many people here. Ervant is a professor emeritus of the city of New York. He taught at Baruch College for most of his career and the CUNY Graduate Center. He's also taught at Princeton, NYU, Columbia, and Oxford. Ervant is the author of many works on Iranian history and the politics of the Middle East. His latest book, Oil Crisis in Iran from Nationalism to Coup d'etat, was published in 2022. And we're very happy to have Ervant here today. Now, we also have a very large group coming in of people who are very well informed about the Middle East and its politics. And so we're going to uh, incorporate your opinions as quickly as possible. Um, all I ask is people to remain on mute. We will unmute you as you raise your hands as we get to that portion of the uh, program today, and just respect the fact that we're well aware of how volatile and emotional these topics can be, and just um, we just I had an experience about a week ago where everybody went bananas, and so I'm a little more conscious of how to maneuver with this. So, Irvan, thank you so much for joining us. Good morning, Irvan.
Sure, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let's just talk in general about the situation we're in. Um, Not only in the Middle East, but generally with Trump's election, with the attempts to change the entire architecture of what has been traditionally known as existing since the Second World War, which is clearly, decisively what they are attempting to do right now. We certainly can see this in the past week. It's very unusual to have an American president in the middle of a conflict with an ally essentially jettison that ally. And then, of course, we're dealing with a situation that you're most familiar with, Iran. So I'm just wondering what your broad sense of all this holistic picture is right now, Iran.
Well, it is as I think the press analyzes it. It's a sort of completely upside down world. It's basically undermining the whole traditional U.S. policies of the past. And more than that, actually, it's so overtly imperialistic that, for a long time we've talked about, well, concepts of imperialism are sort of outdated 19th century. But here we have a president who's talking about taking land from Panama, from uh, Greenland, from Gaza. It's such an overt, blunt 19th century form of imperialism that we really need to go back and look at some of the old theories of both capitalism and imperialism to understand what's going on.
Yeah, it's sort of amazing because, Trump admires Andrew Jackson, and I sort of look on the idea of turning Gaza into the rear, which I understand they've abandoned formally, but we know how ridiculous that was to assert initially. And then to associate the United States with essentially Nakba 2, but in this case, a replay in American history of the Trail of Tears in 1832, quite a stunning event. And then, of course, to act as if we're in a situation automatically like after 1815 in the Congress of Vienna, with the United States basically imposing uh, pure trade for political gain, such as telling Ukraine to turn over 50% of its natural wealth. Amazing stuff to watch. Uh, Now, talk about how you see this situation affecting the situations you're most familiar with, and that is domestic and foreign policy of Iran.
Well, Iran's foreign policy actually has been fairly consistent, and despite the image of mad mullahs wanting to spread Islamic revolution throughout the region, that image has been always false even from the very beginning. The Iranian Revolution was very much a Shia revolution, Iranian revolution. It had very little resonance outside the Shia world. And there, of course, there were some sort of very ambitious people inside Iran who thought they could spread the revolution. But on the whole, from the beginning, the people in charge in Iran have been, in foreign policy, very realistic. And I would say quite moderate in foreign policy. And there's often easy confusion if a regime's internal policy is pretty despicable. The idea is then foreign policy must be also despicable. That's not necessarily true with Iran or any other country. You often get foreign policies that are quite reasonable and internal policies are not, and vice versa. I can give you in history a number of cases, whether it's with LBJ or with Stalin, where you can say Stalin's internal policies were despicable, but his foreign policy was impeccable. With Iran also, you find there have been long periods where internal policies have been despicable, but the foreign policy on the whole has been quite actually moderate and reasonable. And it's been often the US side that has been intransigent and have been unable to come to sort of any compromise. So I think at the moment, the expectations since, uh, uh, Trump is somewhat erratic and extremist and expansionist and is allied to Netanyahu, the expectation is that there'll be sooner or later bombings of Iranian installations, and that could then basically trigger off another war. I'm not sure if that conventional view is going to hold, because I think again, while Trump is unpredictable, sort of somewhat off the cuff, speaks off the cuff, there must be people in the administration who are telling him that bombing is not going to solve the issue. It's going to just create more problems. And clearly, he doesn't want to get involved in another war in the Middle East. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily in the books. So he may have to negotiate with Iran if he wants some sort of basically lowering of the temperature.
How do you see his policy in relationship to this ceasefire agreement with the phase one process essentially coming to a close, and then the problematics of phase two and phase three, which many people, of course, are cynical about whether they're going to happen at all in terms of this ceasefire with Hamas and Israel?
Well, clearly, I think Netanyahu doesn't want the ceasefire to hold. His policy is always the complete destruction of Hamas. But again, there might be the conflict of interest here between the United States and Israel on this. It might be much more in the US interest to actually preserve some sort, not a solution, but sort of keep the temperature down low, instead of having another basically upsurge of crisis in the region. And in some ways, actually, he might be tougher with dealing with Netanyahu than, of course, Biden was.
Hmm. Now, some here are very familiar with Iranian foreign policy since the Iran-Iraq War, certainly since the revolution. But I was wondering if you could just give us your synopsis of how you see that evolving since the Iran-Iraq War, because some will, of course, talk about one of the lessons they draw from this is the need to create buffers, to create space around Iran to prevent it from being directly assaulted as it was by Iraq in 1981, excuse me, 1980. But how do you see their foreign policy evolving and its relationship to what we're seeing right now?
Well, actually, so after the revolution, if you look at the Iranian military budget, it really diminished. very little resources were put in the military, compared especially to the Shah's period. So instead of basically building up a big military, Iran's policy was to have allies wherever they could find it. And of course, in the West, they're called proxies, but I would say I would call them minor allies that Iran relied on as sort of an insurance that if Israel attacked, then they could rely on Hamas or the militias in Iraq or then later in Yemen. And that clearly, that sort of reliance, it wasn't a major reliance, but it's sort of a insurance clearly is weakened because of the defeats of Hamas recently. But I think still Iran's policy is the same as before, which is its main national interest is to avoid war, but to have a nuclear program for its national prestige and, in a way, its national reputation. Having a nuclear project is something not negotiable. The previous American presidents before Obama always insisted that Iran should have no nuclear projects, no nuclear policy, and they should completely disband all nuclear research. Well, as long as that position was held, there couldn't be any negotiations. Then when Obama came in, he actually stepped back from that. And he came to the conclusion, and his offer was that will he accept Iranian nuclear program as long as they can give verifiable guarantees that it will not become a nuclear weapons program. So Iran gave that, and that seems to settle the issue. Then, of course, Trump came along and pulled the rug out of that and said this was the worst agreement the U.S. had ever made. He tore up that agreement, flushed it down the toilet, and that created the new problem, which is Trump says he wants to actually get still an agreement, but better than what Obama had. And I'm not sure what you can get better than Obama, sort of going back to the Bush period of no nuclear projects in Iran, which is, I don't think, will be acceptable to the Iranian elite. So we'd be back to a major confrontation. So the only way I think this administration can now come to an agreement is to, in a way, go back to what the Obama agreement was, which was the worst agreement, so-called, of U.S. agreement. And of course, this administration isn't really bound by reality. They could come to an agreement and and say it has nothing to do with the previous agreement. This is a much better agreement. But the substance will be the same, that Iran will continue to have a nuclear program, but it will be verifiably monitored, so it won't be a nuclear weapons program. That's the only way I can see some sort of settlement on that issue.
Now, there's been a constant debate going on through the Obama administration, through Trump 1, certainly now into Trump 2, to essentially launch a preemptive attack from Israel against the Iranian nuclear facilities that sometimes argued to do it jointly with the United States. So what do you see the prospects of that as an option in this situation?
Well, that argument is usually linked with if you start bombing, the Iranian regime is so fragile that it'll crumble. I mean, it's very much the same repeat of the stuff that we had about Iraq and Saddam Hussein. The problem is, I think, a false premise. First of all, this regime may have a lot of difficulties. It doesn't have the legitimacy and the support it had in 79. but it still has, I would say, 20-25% of the population behind it. It has the Revolutionary Guards behind it. It has public support. And in fact, the nuclear program in Iran is highly popular. And once you start bombing, it's actually going to strengthen the regime. Just to quote, not my favorite person, but Goebbels, remember, said that the Nazi regime was never as popular as when the Allies started dropping bombs on Germans. Even Germans who didn't like the Nazis rallied around the regime because they were being bombed. I think the similar thing would be applied to Iran. If once the bombing starts, it's going to strengthen the regime. Now, the bombing will not actually solve the problem because a lot of these relations are way deep down, rarely buried under. What Iran would do would throw out of international inspectors, and then no one would know what was happening. They could then speed up their nuclear project and go into nuclear weapons program. And also, if Israel doesn't have the type of bombs to solve the problem, which it doesn't, then the US would be dragged into it. So that would be a major problem for this administration if it doesn't want to get involved in any new war. So there's always that danger down the road that should, in fact, bring some reality to the White House about how to deal with Iran.
All right. Now, I want to bring other people in. I'm going to ask Irvan one or two more questions, but please raise your hands. We'll let you come in the order that you raise your hands. Irvan, just explain to us a little bit your sense and take of the domestic political scene in Iran right now.
Well, as I said, I think the regime started with a great deal of legitimacy in 79. Since then, it's done almost a salami tactics on itself. It's cut off this group, that group, that group. And it's to the point that it's actually, as I said, like 20-25% of the population probably supports the regime. A lot of discontent is, of course, on simple things such as women's issues, economic issues tied to predominantly the sanctions. And what you find is there is some flexibility there that, however diehard the regime seems to be on certain issues, for instance, in the last election, Pezeshkian, who is not really allied with the diehards, is much more of I would say, a moderate, was elected. And since then, they've actually quite smartly eased up on questions on women's issues. And they're clearly trying to bring back some of the more, I would say, moderate Islamicists who they had alienated earlier. So they're actually much more openly willing to negotiate. But you have to remember, even the diehards, well, they talked, the rhetoric was, death to Israel, death to the United States. Even they often actually behind the scenes were negotiating with United States. So it's often what is done in the public, which the press here picks up as somehow mad mullahs out to get United States and destroy Israel. Behind the scenes, even the worst elements, such as Ahmadinejad, who denied the Holocaust, during his administration, there were actually ongoing negotiations in Oman between Iran and Obama administration, which eventually led to the Obama agreement. So one has to look at what's happening behind the scenes rather than what's in the streets. And I think the present Pezeshkian presidency is actually much more careful what it says in public and tries to stifle this sort of meaningless denunciations of death to Israel. that to United States and be much more, I think, down to earth in terms of diplomatic language with United States.
All right, thank you. Julian, go on, Julian.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Abrahamian. This is a fascinating talk. I'm very curious about your estimate of what happened to what changed in Tehran to facilitate the Iranian and Saudi ceasefire. I mean, it was a very emotional issue going, way back into the 70s. Was there a generational change? I mean, I would have thought it almost an impossible task, given my perspective of studying Pakistani foreign policy, where the Pakistanis were hoping for this outcome for decades.
Well, I think in the early period, I mean, Khomeini talked about, all monarchies were pagan and therefore non-Islamic should go. So it started off as very anti-monarchical, anti-Saudi. But soon after that, it was much more realistic. Like the Rafsanjani period, things were on state-to-state level. And I think what in more recent decades, the Iranian government came to the conclusion one way of weakening United States in the region was to actually send out a friendly hand to the Gulf states and to Saudi Arabia. And to make it clear that they're not actually, trying to undermine those regimes. And that obviously, the Saudis also came to the conclusion that United States was not going to stick its neck out to protect Saudi Arabia, especially after the missile attack on Saudi Arabia. So they both came to the conclusion it's better to have normal relations between the two. And of course, the Chinese came in also to bring the two together on this issue.
So may I just challenge that interpretation? Iran, about a year ago, fired rockets into Pakistan. And Pakistan's response, looked like the more measured, calculating response of a foreign ministry that's aware of multilateral relations. The people that authorized the rocket launch in Tehran seem to behave impulsively and not to have the attributes that you're describing about, being able to calculate the long-term benefits of calming emotions and turning back decades of state propaganda.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with what went on with the Pakistani issue, but I thought that was linked probably with the Baluchi issue. Because of disturbances in Baluchistan in Iran, they may have thought that actually some of the problems were actually coming from Pakistani Baluchi areas. My guess was that. My interpretation was that. I may be wrong, but that was what made sense for me.
Thank you. I'll have more questions later. Thank you very much, Professor.
All right, thank you, Julian. And again, don't be shy. Just have to raise your hand. I know there's a lot of very well-informed people here on the Middle East in general. We look forward to listening to what your opinions are. Michael, go on, Michael.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Gotcha. Go on.
I can hear you.
Well, first of all, I would take issue with quoting Joseph Goebbels. What happened during the RAF's nighttime bombing, the area bombing of German cities, which was designed to break morale. I don't think it increased morale. Might have increased morale with some people and decreased it with others. The debate is whether or not it achieved the effect of decreasing morale from where it had been prior to the bombings. But I would take a lot of issue with taking anything Joseph Goebbels said at face value or giving any type of substantial value to it whatsoever. But it also, since you bring up the thing about World War II, Trump has also said, or supposedly, that they are going to give Israel bunker busting bombs. Now, during the Second World War, we know from the experiments of Barnes-Wallis that there were things called earthquake bombs, which were not designed to effectively blow up the target. But an earthquake bomb would create a condition in which the target would crumble on its own or cause cracks or damage to it. Could this idea of bunker busting bombs have an effect on the underground facilities? And the other question is, I mean, just to follow up on what Julian said, is about impulsivity. If Iran thought, or without definitely knowing, or without some sort of hard proof that Pakistan was seeking to undermine them, the impulsivity of launching a missile strike would seem to be a problem within the Iranian regime. So if you could address those two issues, the bunker busting bomb and the impulsivity.
Well, I don't know how the decision was made, so I can't say whether it was on an impulse but I would say, the Iranian decision making is on the whole pretty bureaucratic. Decisions are not made on the spur of the moment, unless it's sort of a plane is flying over your head and you have to make an instant decision to bring down the plane or not. But usually when there's a major foreign policy decision, it's taken all the way to the National Security Council, and then a decision is made there. And usually it's fairly, you could say, discussed and fought out before a decision is made. So I don't know in this missile about Pakistan which process was followed. But in terms of course, it's not just Goebbels. There's plenty of other cases where bombing of a country has not brought the other side to its knees. I mean, you could look at Vietnam or any other incidents. And I don't think anyone says the air bombing of Germany actually brought the German regime down. As far as my reading of it, it was the Red Army and the US and the British, the army on the ground that actually defeated the Nazis, not air bombing. In terms of the question about the bunker bombers and bombs and deep storage of Iranian nuclear things. Another problem they're usually given is that a lot of the nuclear research now is now dispersed. So it's not just in one or two deep laid mines in outside home or somewhere where you can either blow up the whole mountain and bury the things, but things have been dispersed all over the place, and some of the places Israelis may not know. So it would be a big risk. You start bombing, but it doesn't solve the problem. After you bomb, a few weeks later, the Iranians say, "Oh, by the way, we now have a number of bombs ready to go." Then what's the next stage? Iran will no longer be processing towards a nuclear bomb. They could announce that they already have a bomb. It's a number of places, it's a number of bombs, and do you want to continue bombing us? So there are risks like that. It's not a sort of simple thing such as, well, we just strike and the problem would be solved. And that's the way actually Netanyahu is trying to present it, very much like that he and others in Israel presented with Iraq. You just get rid of Saddam Hussein and all the problems of the Middle East will be solved. With just one blow, we can sit back and start a new era of the Middle East. So it's the same type of imaginary, optimistic language that is being used that I think is not realistic on what could be achieved in this present situation.
All right.
I was just going to do a follow-up. And what about the idea of hitting specific targets in Iran. In other words, what the Americans did during the Second World War, which was far more effective, was to hit industrial targets. What, in other words, there's a concern. I have a concern that there's a real desire to do bombing on the part of the present American administration. That it's a very viable option. If they limited that to specific industrial targets or something. I'm not saying that any of these things can solve the problem, but what do you think the effect of that would be, where it wouldn't be bombing, it would be specific targets, even if those targets are not, as you said, because of dispersal, are much more difficult to achieve any result. But what do you think the effect of that would be? Because I think it's a concern that we have to deal with, considering the present American administration.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, I think the immediate effects would it will rally Iranians behind the regime. It'll strengthen the regime, and it won't solve any problems.
Yeah, and
I agree. It may not solve any problems, but the fact it doesn't solve problems, maybe that's the route that this administration will take. Invading Iraq didn't solve any problems; just created a lot of new problems. So if it's a bad policy, it could be very well the policy that this administration might follow.
Right. I just want to add to what Irvan's saying that there's no doubt, Irvan quoted Goebbels earlier. I mean, we remember Goebbels in 1943 comes out with his total war speech, and also there's no doubt that the bombing campaign did indeed solidify the popular support to the Third Reich. I mean, we have opinion polls that were conducted by the Gestapo during that period of time that get into that in great detail. And so Netanyahu has always wanted us to embark on a joint bombing campaign into Iran. And I totally agree with the argument that Iran's making. There's been this sort of idea that you bomb them. It sort of reminds you of the kind of air imperial control ideas of the British in the early 20s. You could just simply terrify them with a bombing campaign and they'll just simply break. Their morale will disintegrate. And that, of course, is complete BS. Go on, Alex. You need to unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Ibrahimian. Since you're kind of an expert on the Mujahideen, 𝐂𝐞𝐫𝐯𝐚 have written a book on it. First, I wanted to ask you what you think their role. I mean, there have been accusations that they were involved in some of the recent assassinations, including of Hania in Iran. So I wonder, first, what do you think about that? And second, do you think they work more with the U.S. government now, or with the Israelis in terms of who they ally with, work with, and kind of related? Do you have any thoughts on the kind of developments within the MEK? How things have progressed with the death of the leader, their name, but again, I think his wife is kind of running the organization now. So just what you think generally about obviously they have almost no support in Iran, but they have all this like American politicians who take money from them, and they have their place in Europe. So yes, I wonder what do you think about their role in Iran nowadays? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, clearly they're, I think, financed and supported by Israel. I don't think they have much effect within Iran. In fact, I think the Iranian regime likes to use them as a bogeyman to scare everyone. Said, you may not like us, but you want the MEK to come over. And it's actually surprising that last week, some representative from the the present administration, Trump's administration, was actually at their meeting in Paris. So they're still keeping that connection. But I mean, I think they can provide Israel with some logistical help in assassinations and information. But otherwise, I don't think they're any more a factor in politics.
Okay, thank you, Alex.
And I just also
Go
want to
on.
add, obviously a big thing for Iran has been their, joining BRICS, and their alliances, the agreement they have with the Chinese, and also the one they just signed with the Russians. So I wonder what you think about, obviously these are, from the Iranian government's point, these are important things to them. So I wonder where they put those kind of factors in their thinking.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question because historically, and of course, Khomeini's policy was famous slogan, neither East nor West, a sort of neutralism, keep your distance from the communist East and American West. But that's obviously no longer true. They are very much allied with China and Russia, the East, but no longer communist, but still the East, out of their necessity. I mean, to sell oil, China's been basically a lifeline. It's been very useful. Russia also actually has become an ally of convenience because both Russia and Iran saw U.S. as a sort of expansionist threat. But now things could be changed, and I think this would be a real concern in Tehran. So if there is a rapprochement between United States and Russia, where does that leave Iran with its relations with Russia? It's clearly not going to have Russian support at the UN. And one reason, in fact, Obama was so very successful was he was able to get all these European countries, other countries in the Security Council in the UN together against Iran. So those type of breakdowns could, in fact, it not necessarily help Iran in dealing with United States. So that I think that even more concern about than what happened in Lebanon is what's going to happen between Putin and Trump. And of course, you put it in a larger perspective. From Iran's point of view, United States is a declining power. But another thing they should keep in mind is that declining powers actually are, if they're armed imperial powers, they're more dangerous when they're declining than when they're more secure. So that has to go into their account. And I think someone like Zarif, who was Iran's foreign policy, is quite aware of those sort of nuances in U.S. foreign policy.
All right, thank you, Alex. Let me go to Jim McFadden. Go on, Jim.
Thank you, Professor, for your ideas here. This is great. I have a friend, an Iranian friend, and we've had a lot of discussions, about this situation, and he is pretty confident that Israel is not a real threat to Iran unless it was to use nukes, which would, of course, be an attack on civilians, much like the U.S. did in Japan, rather than such a threat to the military infrastructure. And he says he doesn't think Israel would do that because that would result in an all-out attack by Iran back on Israel, which is actually quite vulnerable because it's such a small country, and so and Iran has built up quite large forces. And his reason, he said, is that is that Iran has been preparing for a U.S. attack for decades, not so much concerned about it, an Israeli attack, which it views as very relatively limited, except for its nuclear capabilities. And so I'm wondering if you agree with that sort of assessment. And then as a follow-up, if Israel used nukes on Iran, would any of the other nuclear powers like Pakistan come to Iran's aid, you think?
Well, the last question is a question. No, the other countries would not. It's not in their national interest. There is no such thing as Islamic solidarity on these issues. But the thing that I think what should concern Israel is if they go that route, start talking about using nuclear weapons. If Iran is pretty close to building a nuclear weapon, hasn't done so, and it's dispersed, then after the first round of explosions, Iran could say, oh, by the way, now we have 6 nuclear weapons. And of course, as you said, Israel is a small place. The only reason they wouldn't use it is they may not want to kill a lot of Palestinians. But if a couple of million Iranians have already been killed by Israeli nuclear weapons, it'd be hard to persuade the Iranian leadership that they shouldn't use the few bombs they have, nuclear bombs on Israel. So I don't think these Israelis are thinking about nuclear weapons. They're actually more in a fantasy land. That somehow Iran is such a fragile state that once you bomb the leadership, kill the leadership, the whole thing will fragment into small ethnic groups. And you often get maps of Iran is in Israel divided into sort of ethnic groups, and that reflects what it was in the 19th century. Yes, if you were doing an ethnic map of Iran in, let's say, 1900, yes, that's true. You have Baluchis, you have Arabs, you have Qashqais, you have Gilakis, Mazandanis, and so on, and you could see the country as a mosaic. But fast forward to the 21st century, that just is not true. It's a pretty solidified nation state with some minorities like the Kurds or the Baluchis, but the rest of the country is fairly solid. And there might be some ethnic identities, but there's above that a national Iranian identity. And once that Iranian state is attacked, it will actually solidify the leadership. And killing leaders has not had much effect in the past. The Mujahideen actually bombed and killed most of the original leadership of the Islamic Republic. All that did was a new group of people came up to top who may have not spent long periods in prison under the Shah, but they had very much similar ideas, and they just replaced the presidency, the prime minister, the members of parliament, and so on. So decapitation and bombing really is not going to solve their problem.
All right, thank you, Jim. Go on, Ruby.
Thank you so much for your time. I just wanted to actually bring up a question that I believe Mr. Spencer Churchill dropped in the chat, but I'm Armenian, so I feel compelled to ask it. What are your thoughts on Iran being sort of a mediator between Azerbaijan and Armenia, especially in light of President Pezeshkian coming to power? I believe he's Azerbaijani, and obviously Azerbaijani and Iranian relations are in a pretty good place right now. Do you see them stepping in, or are they going to, in your mind, kind of remain hands off?
I think, with the question of Iran, Azerbaijan, actually, that's a good example to illustrate that Iran's foreign policy is much more has been almost pragmatic and realistic, rather than anyway ideological or even Islamic. Here you had in the first Armenian-Azerbaijan war, Iran actually supported de facto Armenia against Azerbaijan. And what Iran has to keep in mind is that, of course, it has a large Turkic minority, and concern about that. They don't want to alienate that. But they also see Azerbaijan, the Republic of Azerbaijan, as actually a threat, because Azerbaijan is allied very closely to Israel. And I suspect a lot of the assassinations that have taken place of scientists in Iran come through Azerbaijan. And then the Azerbaijanis, of course, have talked about unification of North and South Azerbaijan, which means much of northern Iran. So from a national state point of view, Iran has to be very wary of Azerbaijan, and that draws it much more towards Armenia. And it much prefers to have a direct access from Iran to Armenia on the geographical area, which then the Azerbaijanis want to cut by building a road to link Azerbaijan with Nakhchivan, which would then actually separate Armenia from Iran. So that's not acceptable either for Armenia or Iran. So that would place Iran's national interest more on the side of Armenia. Now, it's true some of the leaders in Iran, like Pezeshkian, is Turkic, but I think their national identity actually opts its question of ethnic identity. Khamenei himself is of course also Azerbaijani, but that didn't stop him supporting Armenia against Azerbaijan before. So with Iranian politics, you have to be always, I think, put the emphasis on state national interests rather than ethnic interests. And the Israelis keep on thinking more in terms of ethnic politics, which I don't think is realistic.
Okay, Ruby, you got any other questions?
Why do you think why do you think the Iranian regime was hesitant to really get involved in peace negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan? Because obviously this hasn't been resolved. I mean, Azerbaijan just bombed Nagorno-Karabakh, and then the Armenians left, and that's kind of been it since then. Why do you think they were apprehensive to really take a stand on that?
I'm not sure, but it could have been because of their relations with Russia at that time. The Russians at that time were preoccupied with Ukraine and also wanted to be friendly with Azerbaijan. So I think that was sort of limited their scope. But I think the national interests on the whole actually reside on the side of Armenia than Azerbaijan. And of course, you remember, much of the equipment that Azerbaijan is used in Iran were Israeli. That didn't go too well with Iran.
All right, thank you. And Ruby, of course, is reading your book right now. So I put her on the spot. Go on, Bahram.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be able to speak to Professor Abrahamian. My question is, first of all, I was quite impressed with Trump's reversal position and not supporting Ukraine and telling Zelensky that he is a dictator. I am hoping that he could do the same thing with Netanyahu and his position about Israel. Do you think there is any chance about that Trump would come to the right position in the case of Israel, Palestine, the same way he has become in the right position with Ukraine and Russia? Thank you.
No, I think he sees it in a very different situation. He has long-standing relations with Netanyahu and Israel. He may be at heart anti-Semitic, but he thinks that U.S. interests and Israeli interests coincide. With Ukraine, he basically sees American interests as allied with Russian interests at the cost of Ukraine. So, I mean, I think with Ukraine, he may have come to, I think, right conclusions for wrong reasons, but I won't go into that.
Okay, thanks. I had wishful thinking. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bahram. Parzad. You have to unmute Parzad.
Okay. Can you hear me?
We got you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk. I had two questions. First of all, I was wondering that in the event of attacking Iran, nuclear sites or otherwise, or any kind of attack, how would you evaluate the reaction of China or Russia? How this would play out? Would be any reaction, or what types of reactions you would expect? My second question is the conflict between Israel and Palestine is a major player or major issue between in the relationship between the United States and Iran. In a case that a deal is supposed to be made, and I was wondering how this issue would be resolved or could be resolved in making a deal or a better deal or Obama deal or any kind of deal, how that issue would you expect to play out? Thank you very much.
Well, about the Arab-Israeli question first. I mean, I don't see a deal being made, but let's say there was a deal on a two-state solution, which was the long-standing position of the United States. Now, you would think that Iran would oppose that because the slogans are death to Israel. Israel should not be on the map. But again, when you look at it closely, Iranian presidents have often said, and this is the present official position, is that if a two-state solution is acceptable for the Palestinians, Iran would accept it. So they would not have a principled stand against a two-state solution. So if there was a solution on that basis, I would see that I could see them going along with it. So it's not an unsurmountable problem. It's not as if Iran is going to go to war to make sure that there is no state solution and Israel has to be disappear off the map and a large Palestinian state created. There's no maximalist program like that. But often, I've never seen that the American press actually recognize the fact that Iran has, on record, has accepted a two-state solution. What would other countries do if U.S. attacked Iran? Well, I think if there's a rapprochement with Russia, of course, Putin is not going to say anything. He would just say, well, this is the new system of behavior. U.S. is using massive weaponry. Then it's okay for us to use it. Maybe even will say, well, it's okay for us to use nuclear weapons if we find it in our interest to do so. So U.S. has basically started that process. China, again, China made sure that while they have interests in the Middle East, especially buying oil, they are not interested in getting involved in any war in the Middle East. So they might be friendly to Iran in terms of buying oil, but they're not going to stick out their neck into getting involved with a war with United States or Israel about Iran. Their national interests are not the same as Iranian are. And I'm sure the people in Tehran making decisions are quite aware of that. So it's that they don't have, that's not a trump card for them to use against the administration.
All right, thank you. Julian.
Yeah, again, thank you, Professor Abrahamian. I'm curious about what your estimate is for the next decade of the evolution of the evolution of the regime in terms of its domestic policies. The hijab revolution 2.5 years ago took people by surprise. I think the U.S. did not get involved because it actually didn't believe its own public diplomacy that abrupt regime change was possible in Tehran. So I'm wondering how you see what I suspect would be the continued liberalization of the regime, or if not, do you see it stalling at some point? Where do you think the regime will be in 10 years in terms of its relative domestic liberalism?
Let me also add something that you put in the chat here. And that is, what is your assessment of the extent to which Hamas informed Tehran of their operation against Israel, I guess on October 7th, of course? And what are a post-IRGC nationalist territorial demands? They differ, if at all, from those of the current regime. What changes could be expected from a regime change?
I just wanted to add to that I'm not particularly optimistic that regime change is possible in Tehran. And from what I can tell, there's no point having regime change if the current regime's territorial goals are identical to the post-regime change territorial goals. It seems to me that Iran is making the same demands they've made for 500 years, which is not having some European naval power at the mouth of the Straits of Hormuz imposing a tax on Iranian trade, whether it's the Portuguese or the Dutch or the U.S. Navy.
Well, I think I'd agree with you. I think the prospects, if there is no external intervention and unexpected wars, I think the trend is towards liberalization. For simple reason, the ideology and the state is built on a very tight, not just Islamic ideology, the ideology of vilayat faqih, that the jurist, the clerical jurist has the top say. And it's based on traditional Sharia laws. That is not compatible with the new generation that is especially brought up under the new universities, high schools throughout the Iranian system. The new generations now are thinking much more in concepts of not divine power, divine rights. They're thinking in terms of individual rights, and very much without actually articulating it. They're the ideas of the Enlightenment, that each individual has basically natural rights, and those rights are inalienable rights. Some cleric can't come and say, well, no, God says that you have this and that right, but I can take it away from you, or I can define it, or I can limit those rights. For most of the new generation, and this is more and more people are coming educated and basically adopting these ideas. Some people call it modern ideas. I would call it basically natural rights ideas. The only way a regime can basically stabilize itself is to accept and build itself on those rights. The regime will have to basically scuttle some of its so-called Islamic principles and accept these. And in a way, it is doing that. Pezeshkian is without saying it, is saying, well, women can decide whether they wear the scarf or headgear or not. That is basically an acceptance of the French Enlightenment idea of individual choice. So I think to stabilize the regime, it would have to do that. Added to that is that Iran faces horrendous problems, like every country in the region, because of the global warming. So to be able to actually sustain a population, it has to deal with these incredible geographical problems. I would say more deep-seated than, embargo or corruption or inefficiency. The major problems that the world has given Iran and the most of the Middle East, global warming, it has to deal with those issues. And to do that, you need going to religious texts is not going to solve the problem. So about Hamas, clearly Hamas did not consult Iran. It had no reason to consult Iran, and it wouldn't have done because everything of a Hamas attack was done in secrecy. Very few people knew it. Only people within the system involved in the attack were aware of it. If they had told Iran, there would have been leaks because there's so many Israeli agents in the Iranian system. They would have then informed Israel. So there's no way that Iran would have known about pre-known about the attack there.
Okay. Thank you, Frank. Go on, Frank.
I don't quite buy that, but if we look at October 7th, not only was Israel asleep at the wheel, it wasn't even at the wheel. And I recall very, very well when Hussein Amir Abdul-Hayyan, the foreign minister, before he was mysteriously killed in the helicopter accident with the president, that he said something to the effect around about the time just after October 7th. He said that Iran would be the broker to get the 7,000, basically, as I guess you call them, POWs inside Israel, in exchange for the hostages. Now, I believe the way it was couched was that Iran believed that there was a lot of hostages. I mean, we're talking about well over 1,000, and that they did not initially believe, nor did the Hamas leadership up in Lebanon believe, that what happened at the festival actually took place. So you say that they were not in connection with Hamas. There's a lot of unanswered questions about what took place on October 7th. It makes absolutely no sense that the Israelis knew absolutely nothing about what was going on. So anyway, what's your opinion about that? Whether or not the top echelons of the Iranians actually thought that they could do something in terms of an exchange?
So I could not hear the last part. What could Iran have done?
I think Frank was talking about the issue, and Frank can unmute if he wants to correct me. The question of Iran, the Iranian top leadership, being involved in the exchange of people who've been arrested by Israel on the West Bank and Gaza, etc., for the hostages. That the Iranians were aware of that. Is that correct, Frank? You can unmute and correct me.
Well, more specifically, based on what he said, he thought that at least 1,000 were actually taken.
Interesting.
As opposed, and did not believe, nor did Hamas in Lebanon believe, that what happened at the festival and other places, that was propaganda by Israel, and that they actually didn't do all the heinous crimes that they did. And, it would obviously, by the way, from Iranian point of view, as a religious state, want to distance themselves from any kind of action that took place that was described, that did take place at the festival. So, in other words, something went wrong. something went very wrong with what Hamas did. And that was not expected by Iran. And these are all questions that should be out there, but nobody's asking them because it's a fait accompli as far as Israel's concerned. So my question, I guess, is are there questions being put out there regarding what happened October 7th from the Iranian point of view? Because it seems that they expected a simple exchange to take place between about 1,000 captured Israelis and 7,000 POWs, in Israeli prisons.
Right,
Would you agree with that?
Thank you, Frank.
Well, you can always raise questions about this question wasn't raised and so on. I could talk about Kennedy's assassination, 9/11 and so on. There are always some question. But the obvious thing here is, did Iran have pre-knowledge that there was going to be an attack by Hamas on this camp? There is no evidence that there's no logic to it. If there was any information in Iran, the Israeli intelligence, who's very competent inside Iran, would have known that. It's separate from what the Israeli army did or didn't do to prevent that. So I have full confidence that the Israeli intelligence service in Iran would know what if something like that had reached Iran. So there are a lot of questions. Sure, Iran could say, well, what happened wasn't intended, but Hamas says that. So they're repeating what Hamas says. Hamas says that when they attacked, the attack didn't go along the way they were planned it because a lot of freelancers got involved and things happened because of the freelancers from Gaza, that therefore Hamas was not fully responsible for everything that happened there. Iran could be basically reflecting on that Hamas point of view. That doesn't mean that Iran knew beforehand that there was going to be an attack.
All right. Thank you, Frank. Michael. And I should add other people. I can see I don't want to keep Irvan on for like hours here talking about this. So please, if you want to ask a comment or question, please raise your hand because we'll sort of round it up at this point. Go on, Michael.
Yes, I just want to lead in with a point of information. Something that you mentioned before, which is that just as with Joseph Goebbels, a poll by the Gestapo is not what I would consider a reliable source. But anyway, getting back to the point here, do you think that if Iran softened its approach, because Israel is, I mean, if you probably, I have no way of knowing, probably if you took a poll of Israelis, there would be a certain amount of paranoia about Iran. If Iran softened its stance, without softening its stance on the Palestinian issue or something, but softened its approach and its rhetoric towards Israel, do you think, I mean, what effect, what possibility do you think that there would be of that? And do you think that would have at least more positive effect on Israelis and more positive effect on the region? And also following on that, if and we're talking probably about a post-Netanyahu world or post-Netanyahu Israel, but if there were to be a Palestinian state that was satisfactory to both Israelis and Palestinians, that would, in other words, that would raise the possibility of Iran losing, whether you call it a proxy or an ally, in that region. And how, in other words, how that would complicate the situation in Iran.
Well, Iran's, I mean, would be good if Iran dropped its sort of stupid rhetoric like death to Israel and so on. So basically, there was these street slogans that don't help. But let's say tomorrow I dropped that. I'm not sure if the Israelis are going to have a complete change, because the Israeli government is fixated on Israel the same way they were fixated on Saddam Hussein. They need a foreign enemy basically to keep Israel on its toes. There has to be always a existentialist threat to Israel. So even if Iran stops all its rhetoric and, openly talks about a two-state solution, I don't think it's going to make that difference to the Israeli policy. Maybe for some Israeli public it might soften it, but it's not going to make on state level difference. In fact, if Iran becomes more practical, that will I think, disturb Netanyahu even more. There's nothing more he hates than the idea of a two-state solution. Okay, about bombing, it's not just Germany. There are plenty of other cases where massive bombing has not actually brought solution to it. So I would say, even if we don't bring in Goebbels, let's say like at Vietnam or other places, bombing doesn't. Bombing gives a good job for the Air Force to get more bombers and bombs, but it doesn't end wars.
Right. Thank you. And Michael, we can talk about the issue of the Gestapo opinion polls. They indeed were surprisingly objective from the point of view of post-war researchers about how freaked out the average German citizen was. But anyway, Jim, go on, Jim.
I have two things I wanted to ask about. One, and some of this is because of my Iranian friend. He says the Iranian helicopter crash that killed President Raisi, that the Iranian public is pretty sure that this was an Israeli op, and but that the government can't admit that, because for Israel to have infiltrated and been able to carry this out, and so that the weather story, then the way this thing works, he said, is they always have three helicopters and you never know which one it's going to be, the leaders are going to be on. And that was the only helicopter I think that went down is what I recall. And whether that was what you think about that. And then the second question is if you could comment on the exchange between Iran and Israel, which do you think was more effective? And do you think Iran showed restraint, and did it give Israel a heads up? So as part of that restraint, and last, as part of that is did Israel plan a much larger attack at the end, then back down because Iranian radar was picking up their Air Force that was with their attack plan, and so it kind of fell apart.
Okay, whether the helicopter crash was accidental or operational by Israel. You usually have two explanations. One is the obvious one: bad weather, crash, someone got killed. Then you can always say, well, no, there's more to it. There must have been something much more complicated, some sort of plot. To have the plot version, you have to have some evidence of it. There's no evidence of that, but there's quite likely and possibility, and that we know there was bad weather, and the helicopters often crash in Iran. So it's not like an isolated case that suddenly, out of blue, there was an accident, a helicopter accident. In fact, if you look historically in Iran, since 1953, almost no prominent figure has supposedly died naturally. Everyone who's died was due to some conspiracy. Okay, there was a plot. This comes through even in private life. If someone goes to hospital and dies, the family will say the doctors killed this person. Because the idea of somehow you can accidentally or naturally die is sort of blocked. Something must have intervened to cause the death. You can go through a whole series of cases, whether it's Khomeini's son, the Shah's brother-in-law, all these cases, there was always some conspiracy that explains the death. While in fact the normal explanation of natural death or an accident, a plane accident or a glider accident is also there, and it seems I would accept the one that's obvious unless one can find real evidence of a conspiracy. So I would basically dismiss the conspiracy notion. Israel has assassinated numerous scientists in Iran, but I don't see any evidence that they actually knocked down this helicopter with the president in it. The restraints.
Just so that the reason he says is that the government would never admit it in the first place because it would just reflect really, really bad that security was that bad. And that was, I don't know if that's the sort of thing, or if they would use this, oh, Israel attacked us, So I don't know what it was. A very much an embarrassment that this, it would be more of an embarrassment if the military security had allowed that kind of an assassination.
Well, I mean, the security should be embarrassed because there was a series of top scientists who were assassinated, and then there was the Hamas leader who was assassinated in Tehran. So, I mean, for the Iranian public, it's always accepted as a premise that the intelligence services might be very brutal and torture the hell out of you, but they're not very efficient. So I think that's a given. So another case of inefficiency wouldn't make much difference. But whether those basically missile attacks were orchestrated and restrained, obviously there was some pressure from the Biden administration on Israel not to go too far. And the Iranians had the common sense to also restrain themselves. Whether actually the failure of the Iranians to really do much damage, whether that was actually designed that way, or whether because of American, European help and the facilities Israel already has, that prevented much damage. That's an open question. I mean, I don't know. We won't know until the archives are open to see what actually was going on behind the scenes.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Alex, go on, Alex.
Yeah. Professor Ibrahim, I don't know if you've seen or read the new book on the Iranian embassy siege in 1980, that Ben McIntyre did. Because one of the interesting revelations in that, again, it's not a bad book, is a claim that the Abu Nidal organization was behind the attack. In addition to, obviously, we know that the Iraqis they trained the hostage takers. But this idea that Abu Nidal was behind it is interesting because, the standard book on Abu Nidal, which I think is done in the 90s, I think the author is Patrick Seal. He talked to, again, various, not just Arab, but Western intelligence agencies about Abu Nidal. And the conclusion of pretty much all of them was that Abu Nidal was a creation of Mossad. So I've just been trying to think, why would Israel be, and I mean, they're quite clear that basically, again, I think the number two in Abu Nidal was essentially a Mossad asset. So I was trying to figure out what motive in 1980 would Israel have to support and stage the embassy's siege, which obviously the Iraqi interest is obvious, with the war and wanting to discredit Iran and stir up things in Arabistan. But again, I just trying to picture out why Israel would have any motive to do this as well. I couldn't. I just wonder if you would have any speculation. Yeah, why Israel would want to be behind that? Just because again, everybody says Abu Nidal was controlled by Mossad. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I don't know the evidence of the link between Mossad and Abu Nidal, but that clearly Saddam Hussein had a problem, I think, an interest in sort of needling Iran at that time. Especially there was it wasn't a revolt, but there was disturbances in Khuzestan among the Arab minority. So they were trying to probably heat that issue up. But I haven't read the book, but the author has good sources from MI6, MI5, so I'm sure he relies on that. His other books are very good, so I've been meaning to read that.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I look forward to reading that myself. Go on, Julian.
Yeah, I mean, despite all the talk of the Israeli-Iranian standoff, I mean, when I run simulations with my students, I mean, we find over and over again there is no possibility of a war between Iran and Israel, simply because the most they can do is pepper each other with precision-guided bombs. Even if the U.S. provided billions of dollars to support to Israel, I mean, it'd be a very, very expensive way of doing something. If you send 10 soldiers into a reactor with demolition equipment, you can do a lot more damage than if you send in, a 2,000-pound bomb or a drone. But that's my question is actually about Iraq. I mean, I think to the extent that Iran has a major external security concern, it's always been Iraq. And I was wondering if you could give us a quick assessment as to how successful has Iran been, and what is the current status of Iran's satisfaction with the level of influence they have in Baghdad. Do they think things are going well? Do they think things are going backward? And how on a relative level with regard to the U.S. and the Gulf Arab states, how does Tehran assess its relative standing in terms of influence favorable to it in Baghdad?
Okay, and can I also piggyback on what Julian asked you and ask you to talk about Iranian policy towards Syria at this point? Thank you.
Or for Iran and Iraq, what on the surface looks Iran has upper hand. It has a lot of influence in Baghdad. It has a lot of militias there, are trained and funded by Iran. So on paper, it looks like it's sitting pretty. The problem is, I think, I'm sure they're aware of it. Iraq is it's no longer a state. The state was broken with the invasion. Up in the north, you have two Kurdish states. In Baghdad, you have a government that's predominantly Shia, and also in the south. On the western area, it's very unstable because much of that population has no love for the Baghdad government and also for the Kurds. It's predominantly Sunni. And that was the area that was taken over almost overnight by ISIS. Now, ISIS was basically dislodged with a combination of Iranian support and U.S. support. Without U.S. massive bombing of Mosul, basically carpet bombing of Mosul, the ISIS problem would not have been suppressed. So the question, if I was in Tehran, I would worry what happens if there is no U.S. Air Force, no U.S. presence. However, how much I might shout, death to America. If there is no America, what's going to stop that area of Western Iraq becoming ISIS again? For Iran, ISIS is actually even more dangerous than United States. So so the problem becomes very complicated from the Iranian point of view. And that's something they have to worry about. The destruction of Saddam Hussein was a mixed blessing for them. For the short run, sure, they got a lot of influence in Baghdad, but they also actually the situation created a jihadist Sunni movement, which from their point of view is a threat. Iran's role in Syria, obviously it's a setback because Assad was a good ally for Iran, going back years actually. Even during the Iran-Iraqi war, Assad supported Iran against Saddam Hussein. So there was this long alliance. Him gone, obviously they've lost, I wouldn't say a proxy, but an ally. But what happens in Syria, we don't know yet. It's up in the air. You might have complete fragmentation of the state. Alavis may have to rely on outside support to survive. The Turks are going to have a great deal of influence in Syria. This is not going to bode well for Israel. Israel thought they had a major success getting rid of Assad, but they might very well have Turkish troops on their border if Syria continues to not function properly. So I would just imagine these Iranians regime is just waiting to see what happens in Syria before they sort of make any decisions.
Thank you.
It's interesting you raise that, Irvan, because I'm thinking of one of the ironies of Trump going in and trashing USAID is he cut off the contracts of the security firm guarding the ISIS interned individuals. About 9,000 ISIS militants are interned, and they've removed the security or disrupted the pay of those people containing them. Michael, just unmute, Mike.
No, you have to unmute.
Go on, Michael.
Yeah. Well, first of all, yeah, I wasn't able to unmute. It wasn't allowing me to.
No, don't worry about it. We got that under control.
Oh, okay. Because on my last question, the question I just have to. I actually have 2 points here, but with the last question, the point I was trying to make was if the Iranian attitude towards Israel softened, would that, first of all, that might have an effect on taking away Netanyahu's excuse for, need to have an outside enemy, and may have an effect of actually taking away Netanyahu. So I was talking about a post-Netanyahu world. And then I was talking about the idea of what would a Palestinian state that was acceptable to both Israel and the Palestinians have an effect on Iran. So in a post-Netanyahu world, what would be the effects of those two issues? And also, since Jim and I have been going back and forth, but the whole thing about the point I was bringing up about the Gestapo, and this is a whole different aspect of Iran that I wanted to get into. When you have a totalitarian, a brutal state, in which the security forces are using a lot of brutality, and you try to have an opinion poll conducted by the state or by those forces, obviously people are going to think twice about what they answer. So what is the possibility, do you think, of finding out exactly what the Iranian people think about their regime and the activities of their regime. So those are two completely separate issues.
Okay, post Netanyahu. Good question. It's a bit hard to speculate because sure, if Iran softens its face after Netanyahu, if there is no Iran there, no successor government is going to be able to use Iran as an existential threat. But the problems, I think, beyond Iran, the question in Israel is still very much the Palestinian issue. So as long as that's there, politics in Israel are going to be very divisive and very difficult. So somehow the idea is if Saddam Hussein was not there, now Iran is not there, the Middle East is going to be different. People are going to be reasonable, sit around the table and talk like an American diplomat said, instead of being Jews and Muslims, they'll sit and like good Christians sort out their differences. This is right after World War II. But I think in the situation, the Palestinian issue is central, and that has to be grasped with. Until that is not grasped with, things are going to remain tense in Israel and in the region.
And the idea also was if there was a Palestinian state, how would that affect Iran's calculation? Because they may possibly then lose an ally as far as the Palestinians if there was, in an idealistic world, a rapprochement between the Israelis and Palestinians.
Well, I mean, from a state realistic point of view, the Palestinians are not an ally. They're not a great asset for Iran at the moment. So, if there is a Palestinian state, and even if it's pro-American, it's not going to make much difference to them. It'll mean just there is no Palestinian issue dominating politics of the region. But they would have no choice but to live with a Palestinian state, even if it's pro-American. So, I mean, they would be realistic there. Look, Arafat, at one time when the revolution came, he was a great welcome and great reception in Iran, hugged Khomeini. But once the Iraqi war started and Arafat basically sided with Saddam Hussein, relations between Iran and the Palestinian movement basically broke down on that. Khomeini felt that Arafat had betrayed the Iranian Revolution by not siding with Iran. So I mean, I don't think Iran's foreign policy is really hostage to the Palestinian issue. If the Palestinian issue is solved, then they have no choice but to go along with it.
Right. And the internal, the idea of finding out what the Iranian population, given the probable inaccuracy of polls taken by the government, of what the Iranian population thinks as a whole of what's going on.
I don't know what they've taken recently, but actually until a few years ago, the University of Maryland used to do phone polls that were quite reliable because people actually would be more than willing to talk for hours on the phone. You'd call to ask a few questions, and the people at the other side would go on wanting to talk as long as they wanted to. As long as you didn't ask a question such as, should the supreme leader be removed or something, a very sensitive question. On other questions, on what issues were at their concern, what was hurting them, what they would want. They were actually quite reliable on those. and some of their actually polls on elections turned out to be quite accurate. I'm not sure if that project still continues, but that was going on in the 1910s.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Now, does anybody else have any comments or questions they wanted to ask to Irvan before we bid you a good day? Go on, Alex.
Yeah, just I don't know if you ever see Professor Mohammed Marandi of Tehran University, because he often comes on to discuss this or that issue. I know he's at some point was involved, I think, in the 𝐀𝐞𝐫𝐯𝐚 negotiations, and of course, again, he's professor of American studies, so he has an interesting perspective on American Iran. Yeah, and he's been saying for a while that Iran would conduct another missile attack on Israel in retaliation for the last Israeli attack on them. I guess would be like True Promise 3. So I just wonder if you think that's something the Iranian government would actually do, and if they're not actually going to do it, why would they put out the idea that they might attack Israel again? Yeah, I wonder if you could speculate on that. Thanks.
Well, he represents government point of view. He's a government spokesman. I wouldn't call him a professor. So what he says is what the government wants to say. And I think the government here is a bravado. We're willing to tit for tat, which is obviously they're not in a position to tit for tat. So,
yeah, he's quite a character to watch him on Piers Morgan. Go on, Layla.
Yes. Sorry, I have a question about the internal issues of Iranian government. So the governmental statistics shows that there is like more than 30% of absolute poverty in Iran. And there are many movements, people are under economic pressure. And I think that maybe you have some explanation for this. Do you think that this kind of problems, economic problems for the people, will force the government to change its policies or economic policies, or does it have some sort of effect on the government, or there is just a kind of dichotomy between the nation and the state?
Well, there are economic problems, and clearly the sanctions don't help. Global warming doesn't help. There is also increasing, basically, more people coming out of universities, colleges, and not enough jobs, so that these are problems there. But that necessarily doesn't translate to a breakdown of the regime. I think that the regime still has enough controls and support to survive. But what I think that there's a difference here in the government is how much priority they put on trying to meet these issues rather than focusing on national security and war. And I think this is where the breakdowns, I think, between diehard conservatives and more liberal, I wouldn't call them necessarily progressives, but more liberal people like the present president think that priority should be given to actually meeting some of the social economic needs. So that's interesting that actually whenever there are free competitive elections, it's invariably the more liberal side that wins, sometimes a landslide. So the question about public opinion, this actually is verified by whenever there is an open election. And as soon as there is an opening, people will vote for the more liberals. Well, not because they necessarily support liberalism, but they support the priority given to economic needs. Plus, restraint on the judiciary and its implementation of diehard interpretations of religion.
You have more follow-up, Layla? You can unmute if you want.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay. Does anybody else have any other comments they want to make? Because I have one more. I'd like to just ask Irvan. We didn't bring up Hezbollah and Lebanon or the Houthis, and I'm wondering what your take on that is in this situation before we close out.
Well, with Houthis, Iran really was very sort of, I would say, indirect or distant relations. They have their own, basically, base, their own interests. They like to be allied with Iran, but they do their own things. So I don't think Iran has much influence there or much at stake there. With Hezbollah, of course, they had basically supported fully Hezbollah, and its decapitation seems like a major blow at Iran's interest. But again, decapitation here is not going to solve the problem. There's going to be a new generation of leaders. And Hezbollah is not just an organization. It basically is the expression of the Shia population in Lebanon, which is the largest ethnic group in Lebanon. So as long as Lebanon exists and there is a Shia community there, there will be some form of Hezbollah. So Iran may have lost something in the bombings in Lebanon, but it still can rely on the Hezbollah reviving. And once it revives, it will be basically still a major problem for Israel. Maybe even a bigger problem, because Israel has clearly not interested in evacuating from Lebanon. And that's going to alienate more Lebanese and even non-Shia Lebanese who don't like Hezbollah will have no choice basically but to support Hezbollah because they don't like Israel occupying parts of Lebanon.
And last question takes us right back to what we started with, which was talking about Trump's policy in the Middle East. And Shabazz asks, what is your take on Trump's plan on Gaza?
Well, I mean, one can only laugh about the Riviera stuff. I don't know if they already have thought out what they can do. You have a large 2 million population. They're not going to move anywhere. They're not. It'd be hard to force them to move anywhere. So Israel, United States will have to no choice but somehow observe the rebuilding of the Gaza to where it was before. So the solution will be back to where it was before. And Netanyahu would not have got what he wanted, which was basically the minimalist was the destruction of Hamas. That hasn't happened. If his other intention was ethnic cleansing of Gaza, that's not in the books. It's not just feasible.
Right. All right. I should note for those tuning in that next week at this time at 1 o'clock, we'll be having a discussion with Professor Peter Fritsch, who is a professor of German history at the University of Illinois. And he will be talking about his book, Hitler's First 100 Days. So we can sort of speculate about the analogies between what we're living through right now and what happened in 1933. But that's next Sunday at 1 o'clock. But I want to thank Irvan Abrahamian for joining us today. It's always a great pleasure to have you talk, Irvan. I know we were exhausting you.
No.
You had some water there, guy.
Good questions.
Yeah. No, but we want to thank you so much for spending time And I want to thank everybody who came here. I was actually surprised because we had some individuals I expected who would ask questions, but I don't want to start it off again. If possible, we can certainly do this another time, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments again down the road. Thank you so much, Irvan.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming today. It was a great pleasure to have everybody here. Have a good afternoon.